June 9, 1944. 3 days after D-Day. A road south of Tilly-sur-Soils, in the Normandy bocage. The leading elements of the Panzer Lehr division, which by reputation was the finest armoured formation in the German army, had just rolled into their assembly area after a 90-mile road march from the city of Chartres. Their commander, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, was already counting the cost of the journey. Over the previous 3 days and nights, in a series of attacks that began the moment the division left its hide positions and never let up, Panzer Lehr had lost up to 200 vehicles, including roughly 130 trucks, 84 half-tracks and self-propelled guns, and 5 tanks. None of those losses had been inflicted by enemy ground forces. They had all been the work of aircraft. Bayerlein, walking the wreckage along the route his division had taken, gave the road a name in 2 German words. He called it the Jabo Rennstrecke, the Jabo racecourse. The phrase entered the unit's after-action vocabulary and survived in the records of the Wehrmacht. The word that did the work in that phrase was Jabo. It was an abbreviation, hammered down from the longer-term Jagbomber, the German military word for a fighter aircraft also rigged to carry bombs. By those mornings on the road from Chartres, however, the abbreviation had begun to mean something the longer word never had. It had begun to mean the silence that fell over a column when a single airplane appeared at the far end of the road. It had begun to mean the moment when a Panzer division pulled itself off the highway and into the trees because a sergeant had heard, for the second time in an hour, the high distinctive whine of a Pratt & Whitney radial engine somewhere above the cloud line. By the end of that summer, the word Jabo had been pressed into compounds, into slang, into private letters, and finally into the operational vocabulary of an army that no longer had a better word for what was being done to it from above. The question this whole investigation turns on is not why the German army was losing the war by the summer of 1944. There are 100 answers to that question, and most of them are familiar. The question is narrower. Why did German soldiers, in the middle of a global war, in the middle of speaking a language with one of the richest military vocabularies on earth, feel the need to invent a brand new word? What was the experience above them so unlike anything in their previous training that the existing German military lexicon could not contain it? Why did the army that had given the world Blitzkrieg and Schwerpunkt suddenly find itself reaching for a tiny improvised slang word, hammered down from 4 syllables to 2, in order to describe what was being done to it from the air? To answer that question, we have to begin not with a German soldier in a Normandy ditch, but with a small group of American engineers in a factory on Long Island in 1940, designing an airplane that almost no one in the United States Army Air Forces actually wanted. Part 1. In the summer of 1940, while German tanks were still rolling through France and the Royal Air Force was preparing for the Battle of Britain, an aeronautical engineer named Alexander Kartveli was sitting at a drafting table in Farmingdale, New York, sketching a fighter aircraft that almost everyone he worked with thought was a bad idea. Kartveli had been born in Tbilisi, in what is now the Republic of Georgia, and had been trained at the École Supérieure d'Aéronautique in Paris in the early 1920s before emigrating to the United States. He had ended up at Republic Aviation Corporation, where he had become chief designer. The American military had recently asked the American aircraft industry for a high-altitude interceptor. The specifications were brutal. They wanted a fighter that could climb to 25,000 feet, hit 400 miles per hour, carry self-sealing fuel tanks, armor for the pilot, and at least 6 and preferably 8 heavy machine guns. Kartveli read the specifications and made a decision that ran against the entire prevailing direction of fighter design. He did not try to make a smaller airplane, he made a bigger one. He took the largest air-cooled radial engine in American production, the Pratt & Whitney R2-800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder power plant that put out 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, and he built an airframe around it that nobody had attempted in a single-seat fighter. The empty weight came in at almost 10,000 pounds. Fully loaded, the airplane would weigh about 8 tons. It carried 850 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, fed by ammunition boxes holding 350 rounds per gun, 2,800 rounds in total. Pressing the trigger for a single second poured roughly 100 bullets into whatever the pilot was pointing at. Kartveli, looking at his own design, said something that became famous inside Republic aviation. He said the aircraft would be a dinosaur, but it would be a dinosaur with good proportions. The airplane that came off his drafting table became the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and when the first prototypes flew in 1941, the reception inside the United States Army Air Forces was lukewarm. American fighter doctrine, like fighter doctrine in most other countries, still believed in agility above all things. The new German Focke-Wulf 190 was a small, vicious, fast-turning machine. The British Spitfire was a model of compact precision. Pilots looked at the Thunderbolt and saw a flying truck. They nicknamed it the Jug, a name that was either short for juggernaut or simply a description of the fat, milk jug shape of the fuselage. When the first P-47s reached England in early 1943 and were handed over to the 8th Air Force at Royal Air Force Debden, the assigned pilots were appalled. One of them, a young American named Irwin Miller, recorded what he and his men felt the first time a Thunderbolt taxied up next to their Spitfires. He wrote that the wingtip of the new fighter came higher than the cockpit of the Spitfire. He wrote that the cockpit of the Thunderbolt was so large the men felt that if they slipped off the seat they would break a leg. He wrote that the squadron, looking at the 7-ton monster, considered it a true air inferiority fighter, and could not imagine how they were going to fight Focke-Wulfs in it. For the next year and a half, the P-47 was used in Europe primarily as a high-altitude bomber escort, where its turbocharged engine and heavy firepower made it formidable, but where its range limitations kept it tied to the bomber stream. Many in the Army Air Forces quietly believed that when the new North American P-51 Mustang arrived in numbers, the Thunderbolt would be relegated to a secondary role. What none of them had yet understood, including Cartvelli himself, was that the very qualities the pilots were complaining about, the weight, the bulk, the 8 machine guns, the legendary ability to absorb battle damage, would turn out to be wrong for one job and exactly right for another. The Thunderbolt was a poor dogfighter against a skilled Focke-Wulf pilot at 15,000 feet, but on the deck, at low altitude, with bombs and rockets under its wings and a German truck convoy in front of its nose, it was something the world had not yet seen. Part 2. The man who saw it first, and who arguably did more than any other single human being to turn the P-47 from a heavy escort fighter into the most feared close support aircraft in the United States Army, was a 40-year-old Major General named Elwood Quesada. He went by Pete. He had been born in Washington in 1904 to a Spanish father and an Irish-American mother, and he had enlisted in the United States Army Air Service as a flying cadet in 1924. By the early 1940s, he had built a quiet reputation as a man who paid obsessive attention to two things that most fighter generals of his era did not. He paid attention to radio communications, and he paid attention to ground commanders. In the autumn of 1943, Quesada was sent to England. He took over the IX Fighter Command, which would later be redesignated the IX Tactical Air Command in April of 1944, and his job was to figure out how American fighter aircraft would support the largest amphibious invasion in history. He did something unusual. He moved his headquarters within walking distance of Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, who would command the United States First Army on D-Day. The two men, the unflashy Missouri infantryman and the dark-haired aviator with his wrinkled cap and open smile, became friends. Bradley would later write, in his memoir, A Soldier's Story, that Quesada saw the fighter as a little-known weapon with vast unexplored potentialities in support of ground troops. They were two of the few senior officers in the Anglo-American military who fully believed that the airplane and the tank were going to fight as partners, not as separate kingdoms. Just before the breakout at St. Lo in late July, Quesada walked into Bradley's command post and made a proposal so unusual that the Army staff officers around them did not at first believe it was serious. He told Bradley to concentrate his armor and to push hard. In return, Quesada said he would put a flight of 4 P-47s above every American armored column from sunrise to sunset. The pilots above the column would be in continuous radio contact with a man riding inside the lead tank, an air support party officer with a regular, very high-frequency aircraft radio bolted to the inside of a Sherman. If the column ran into trouble, the man inside the tank would call up to the airplanes overhead by name. The airplanes would come down. Anything blocking the road would burn. Bradley agreed on the spot. 2 Sherman tanks were sent to Quesada's headquarters for trial modification. The conversion was crude. A pilot would sit in the turret of an armored vehicle that had not been designed to hold a man, talking by radio to other pilots flying overhead. But it worked. By the time Operation Cobra exploded out of the Normandy bocage on July 25, the system had a name. They called it Armored Column Cover. And on the morning the American armor uncoiled south, 4 P-47s were already overhead. The system that followed was, in the unsentimental language of post-war military analysts, the most effective close air support arrangement of the entire Second World War. 4 Thunderbolts orbited the column. As soon as those 4 ran low on fuel or ammunition, 4 more arrived, the relief flights operating in roughly half-hour shifts. Targets that would once have required a battalion of artillery and 20 minutes of fire mission planning were now hit by men who had been told the location over a radio in less time than it took a sergeant to light a cigarette. For the German army, which had spent 4 years getting used to a tempo of war it had largely set, this was a different planet. Their own Stuka dive bombers, which had terrified Polish and French troops in 1939 and 40, had operated on a centralized command system that took hours to redirect from one target to another. The Allied system being assembled above their heads in Normandy operated in minutes, and it never stopped. Part 3. The Panzer Lehr division, which we left at the start of this story counting its losses along the Jabo Rennstrecke, was not an outlier. What was happening to it was happening at the same time to the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich on a different road. Das Reich was racing north from Toulouse toward the invasion front, taking time along the way to commit one of the most notorious massacres of the war at the French village of Oradour-sur-Glane. As soon as the column crossed the Loire, the fighter bombers fell on it. The historian Max Hastings, drawing on German first-hand accounts, recorded that the convoys of Das Reich were forced to abandon daylight movement after the towns of Saumur and Tours and could only crawl northward through the blackout. He recorded one moment in particular. During a routine change of command, a flight of Allied fighter bombers smashed into the column with rockets and cannon. Within minutes, 16 trucks and half-tracks were burning. Tank crews leapt from their vehicles and tried to crawl underneath the hulls for cover. They did this not once but again and again, all the way to Normandy. The cost paid by the German General Officer Corps in those weeks tells you what the air situation had become. 5 German general officers were killed in the first 2 weeks of the Normandy fighting. 3 of them, Generals Erich Marx, Heinz Helmich, and Rudolf Stegmann, were killed by Allied air attack. The shells that killed Helmich on June 17 and Stegmann on June 18 were 20mm cannon rounds, fired from low-flying aircraft. Marx had gone the same way 5 days earlier near Heberkreven, just northwest of St. Lo. The losses of the German generals in Normandy were so frequent, and so often the work of fighter bombers, that German soldiers began to use a new piece of slang for what had killed them. They called it Jabo Tod, death by Jabo. There is no formal military category by that name in any of the Wehrmacht's surviving casualty rolls, but as the historian Robert Citino has documented, the phrase circulated in the spoken language of the troops and the field hospitals as the casualty count from Allied air mounted. Even the most senior German commander in the West was not safe. On the late afternoon of July 17, 1944, on a country road near Sainte-Foy-de-Montgomery, between Livarot and Vimoutiers, a German staff car carrying Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was strafed by a Spitfire of the Royal Air Force 2nd Tactical Air Force. The driver was killed at the wheel. The car careened off the road and overturned. Rommel was thrown into a ditch with a fractured skull and serious head injuries. He never returned to active command and was forced into suicide 3 months later for his peripheral role in the July 20 plot. The identity of the pilot has been argued over for 80 years. The traditional attribution to squadron leader Chris Leroux of 602 Squadron has been challenged by archival research published since the early 2000s, which has shifted the consensus toward Flight Lieutenant Charlie Fox of 412 Squadron of the Royal Canadian Air Force. Whoever pulled the trigger, the fact remains that on a clear afternoon in Normandy, the most famous field marshal in the German army was put out of the war by a fighter pilot, doing exactly the kind of armed reconnaissance the Allies were now flying every day all day long, over every road in France. Part 4. The greatest single demonstration of what American fighter bombers could do to a German army occurred between August 7 and August 21 of 1944, and it took place in 2 acts. The first was the Battle of Mortain. The second was the Falaise pocket. Together, they ended the German army's ability to mount organized resistance west of the Seine. Mortain came first. It was Hitler's idea, and most of the German generals on the spot believed it would fail. After the American breakout at St. Lo, Hitler ordered Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge to assemble 4 Panzer divisions, including the elite 1st SS Leibstandarte and 2nd SS Das Reich, and to drive west through the small town of Mortain to the coast at Avranches, cutting off the United States Third Army that was just beginning to swing into Brittany. The codename was Unternehmen Lüttich, Operation Liege. Around 300 German tanks were committed. 2 things doomed the operation before it began. The first was the Allied code-breaking program at Bletchley Park, which by August 4 had decrypted the orders for the entire counter-offensive. Bradley knew when the Panzers were coming, where they were aiming, and roughly how many they would be. The second was Pete Quesada's IX Tactical Air Command, which had now been on the continent for 2 months, and was operating from a network of advanced landing grounds ploughed straight into the French countryside by aviation engineers who laid down strips of perforated steel planking and steel mesh on bare earth. The Germans crossed their start lines in darkness on the night of August 6 and 7. By the early morning of August 7, they had taken some ground. They had briefly captured Mortain. Then the morning fog burned off, and the sky above Normandy turned a clear, hard blue. What happened next has been told many ways, but the simplest version is the truest. Bradley made a single phone call to Quesada's headquarters and asked for everything Quesada had. Quesada gave it to him. The IX Tactical Air Command flew about 400 sorties into the Mortain battle area on August 7 alone. The Royal Air Force Hawker Typhoons of 83 Group flew nearly 300 more, firing more than 2,000 rockets and dropping 80 short tons of bombs. The American P-47s carried 500 and 1,000-pound bombs, high-velocity aircraft rockets, and the 8 Browning 50 caliber guns that had now become a kind of signature sound in the lanes of Normandy. The men of the United States 30th Infantry Division, who were holding the high ground around Mortain and who had watched the Panzers come at them out of the dark a few hours earlier, looked up that morning and saw their air force. The German tanks below them did not have that option. Hitler's original order had demanded that the Luftwaffe commit 1,000 fighters in support of the operation. By the eve of battle, Luftwaffe planners told 7th Army that no more than 300 could be assembled. According to Luftwaffe records, not a single one of those German fighters reached the battlefield over Mortain. They were engaged by Allied aircraft from the moment they took off, and most never got past their own front lines. The American 406th Fighter Group, flying P-47s carrying high-velocity aircraft rockets, claimed 12 to 13 Panzers killed by rockets that day, along with 4 half-tracks, 5 staff cars, and 4 light flak positions. They fired roughly 600 rockets in the doing of it. Across the entire Mortain area, the American fighter bombers and their British counterparts together claimed dozens of tanks and roughly 200 soft-skinned vehicles destroyed in a single afternoon. But the numbers are only the surface. The deeper story is what happened to the ability of the Panzer divisions to function as fighting formations once the fighter bombers were overhead. Tanks stopped moving because their crews were terrified to drive in daylight. Trucks pulled into the trees and stayed there. The supply columns behind the lead elements got cut off, then bombed. The German official account of the day records, in the dry language of staff officers, that the armoured crews stopped any progression for fear of being the victim of an Allied attack. Translated out of staff officer English, that means the men inside the tanks would not drive their tanks. By the night of August 7, the German offensive at Mortain had been blunted. By August 12, the Old Hickory soldiers of the 30th Infantry Division, an outfit drawn from National Guard units in Tennessee and the Carolinas, with a tradition reaching back to the First World War, had held their ground against 4 Panzer divisions, and the offensive was over. Hitler ordered it renewed anyway. Kluge, who already feared he was about to be implicated in the July 20 plot to kill Hitler, complied. The Germans pushed their armour deeper into the Allied trap, and then came Falaise. Part 5. By August 12, the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were inside a closing pocket between the Canadian Army pressing south from Caen and the American forces pressing east and north from Mortain and Le Mans. There was, for a time, a single narrow gap in the Allied ring, a stretch of roads east of the town of Falaise that ran through small villages including Trun and Chambois, and that emptied across the Dives River toward the Seine. Through that gap, the German army in Normandy tried to escape. For a week between about August 14 and August 21, the gap became a killing ground that had no real parallel on the Western Front. The high ground above the Dives, particularly Mont-Ormel, gave Allied observers an unbroken view across the entire pocket. The Royal Air Force 83 Group alone flew up to 1,300 sorties on the heaviest day of the battle, August 18. American P-47s of Quesada's command and of the X-9th Tactical Air Command under Otto Weyland attacked German concentrations in the western and northern ends of the pocket and ranged ahead of Patton's armour as it raced east. The Royal Air Force Hawker Typhoons of 2 Tactical Air Force dove into the choked roads at the eastern end of the gap with rockets and 20mm cannon. What they hit was a German army that could no longer move. The roads were choked with horse-drawn artillery, panzer columns, supply wagons, ambulances, staff cars, and on-foot soldiers. The fighter bombers killed the vehicles at the head of each column first, blocking the road. Then they came back and worked methodically down the length of the stalled traffic. When the rockets and bombs ran out, the cannon kept firing. When the cannon ran out, fresh aircraft were already on their way. An Australian Hawker Typhoon pilot, recorded anonymously by the historian Anthony Beaver, wrote later about a single afternoon's work in the gap. He wrote that they had let go their rockets and then strafed the men who had survived with cannon fire. He wrote that after each pass there was an empty path through the crowd of soldiers, and that within seconds the empty path had been filled in again by other men trying to get past, only to be cut down by the next pass. The pilots in those squadrons were averaging 6 sorties per day. They were living and flying in a state of exhaustion that some of them said afterward they could not properly remember. Lieutenant General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz of the 2nd Panzer Division, looking down at one of these roads, wrote in his after-action report that he saw mountains of vehicles, dead horses, and dead soldiers scattered everywhere, and that the count increased from hour to hour. General Heinrich Eberbach, the commander of Panzer Group West, would write after the war that the loss of tanks through lack of gasoline and through air attack was greater than the losses inflicted by all kinds of enemy weapons put together. The numbers, when the dust settled and the British and American historians counted, were these. In the northern sector of the pocket alone, the Germans abandoned or had destroyed 344 tanks, self-propelled guns and other light-armoured vehicles, 2,447 soft-skinned vehicles, and 252 artillery pieces. Estimates for total German troops trapped in the pocket cluster between 80,000 and 100,000. Of these, roughly 10,000 to 15,000 were killed, and 40,000 to 50,000 taken prisoner. The rest escaped on foot, having abandoned almost everything they owned. Most of the destruction along the eastern roads was done by the Royal Air Force Typhoons, but the entire pocket existed, in the form it took, because of what American P-47s had done over the weeks before. They had broken the German armour at Mortain. They had mauled the columns trying to retreat. They had so completely shut down German daylight movement that an entire field army was forced to flee at night, on country lanes, and was caught in a bag of its own making. Falaise was the verdict on a summer's worth of work by Quesada's pilots and their British counterparts. It was also the moment when the word Jabo finished its journey from technical abbreviation to lived nightmare. If your father or your grandfather flew with the 9th Air Force, in a Thunderbolt or a Mustang or a Marauder, I would be honoured to read his name in the comments below. Most of these men flew with squadron numbers and tail markings that no civilian remembers. Most of them are gone now. The story of what they did over those small French roads in 1944 is one of the largest and least appreciated military achievements of the entire war, and the small details, the names, the squadrons, the airfields, are the part that the official histories cannot keep alive. You can. Part 6. The question now becomes harder. Why did this work? Why did fighter bombers, used by every major air force in the war and pioneered by the Germans themselves with the Stuka, become a war-winning weapon in American hands by the summer of 1944? The answer is not just the airplane. The airplane mattered, but the airplane alone would not have been enough. The first part of the answer is the system that Quesada and Bradley built around the airplane, and it ran on something quietly American. It ran on radios and on trust, in roughly equal measures. The man inside the lead tank with the very high-frequency aircraft radio was usually a pilot. Quesada had insisted on this from the beginning. He said that only a pilot would know how to describe a target the way a pilot needed to hear it described, and only a pilot could make the split-second judgments about whether to send a flight in or wave it off, because friendly troops were too close. The American system of close air support had not, in 1943, looked like it would lead anywhere. Most of the senior commanders in both the Army and the Air Force had treated tactical air support as a poor relation of strategic bombing. Quesada, by force of will and by personal friendship with Bradley, had built a different system in plain sight. The second part of the answer is the airplane itself, but in a way that was not visible to its first pilots. The Thunderbolt's weight and bulk, which had appalled the Debden Squadron in early 1943, turned out to be exactly what was needed for the work it ended up doing. It could absorb hits from German light flak that would have torn a Spitfire apart. It could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs or 10 high-velocity aircraft rockets, while still mounting 8 machine guns. The radial engine forward of the cockpit acted as an enormous shield for the pilot. P-47 pilots came home from low-level missions over France with whole cylinders shot off their engines, with control surfaces in tatters, and they came home because the airplane simply would not break. The third part of the answer is something Americans almost never put into doctrine because they did not know they had it. The American pilots flying these missions in the summer of 1944 were, as a group, the same population the Army had drawn its squad sergeants from. They had grown up in a country that encouraged them to take engines apart on kitchen tables, to run pick-up baseball games without an adult in sight, to drive a tractor at 14, to weld their own bumper guards onto pickup trucks. When they were dropped into a P-47 cockpit and told there was a German truck convoy on a road in Normandy, they did not need a manual on how to find it. They did what they had done their whole lives. They looked at the situation and figured it out. The German fighter pilot of 1944 was by contrast often a teenager with a few dozen flight hours and a doctrine that had been written years before by men who were now dead. The American fighter bomber pilot was a young man flying a tank with wings, working off radio calls from a sergeant in a Sherman who was sometimes a friend of his from training, and the only pressure on him was to do the job and come home. Part 7. Which makes the next question the obvious one. Why could the Germans, who had invented the modern fighter-bomber concept, not produce an answer? In 1940, when Stuka dive bombers had screamed down on Polish and French infantry columns, the Luftwaffe had been the most effective close support air force on Earth. Where had it gone? The answer is the same as the answer to most questions about the late war Wehrmacht. It had been killed. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter arm had been bled white in 2.5 years of attritional combat against the United States 8th Air Force over Germany. Between January and May of 1944, more than 2,200 German single-engine fighter pilots were killed. In May alone, roughly a quarter of the German Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 pilot strength was wiped out in a single month of combat. The men with hundreds of victories, the men who had trained the next generation, were largely dead. Their replacements had been pushed through training in a few months and were being put into airplanes against American pilots with 3 times their flight hours. On D-Day itself, the entire Luftflotte III, the German air fleet responsible for the defense of Western Europe, mounted only about 250 sorties against the largest amphibious invasion in history, and barely 100 fighter sorties got over the beaches at all. By Mortain in August, the Luftwaffe could not deliver the 300 fighters its own commanders had promised, much less the 1,000 Hitler had ordered. A weapon system that had once let Germany dictate the pace of war in Europe had been mathematically dismantled, one pilot at a time, in dogfights over Schweinfurt and Berlin and Hanover that the German public was not allowed to see. The German army on the ground, which had once expected its own air force to suppress enemy fighter bombers, found itself in the summer of 1944 entirely without that protection. The light anti-aircraft guns the Panzer divisions carried, the 20mm and 37mm flak weapons, were dangerous to a low-flying P-47 and shot down a great many of them, but they could not be everywhere. A Thunderbolt diving on a column from out of the sun was usually gone before the gunners could swing their weapons around. The German soldiers learned that the only safe time to move was at night. Then they learned the only safe time to move was during heavy rain. Then they began to mark in their letters home that there was now no safe time to move at all. This is the moment when a language begins to invent. Soldiers in the trenches of 1917 had invented their own slang for shells, for rats, for trench foot, for the long boredom and the sudden death. Soldiers in 1944 invented Jabo and Jabo Todd and Jabo Rennstrecke. They were doing what soldiers always do. They were giving names to what was killing them. The fact that the Wehrmacht, with its already enormous military vocabulary, had to invent these new words tells you, more clearly than any statistic, that what was happening in the skies above the Western Front in 1944 was something the German army had no previous category for. Part 8. The final test of the system came in the winter of 1944–45, in the snow and pine forests of the Ardennes. During the German counter-offensive, the Allies would name the Battle of the Bulge. When the Germans launched their last major offensive in the West on December 16, 1944, the weather was their ally. Heavy fog and low cloud kept the American and British fighter bombers grounded for nearly a week. The German panzers, including units that contained survivors of Mortain and Falaise, drove forward through American lines with something close to the freedom they had not enjoyed since 1940. For 7 days, the German columns moved in daylight on roads in eastern Belgium and Luxembourg. Their officers told them, with a touch of black humour, that the absence of the Jabos was the best Christmas present they would ever receive. Some of them began to believe again that the war could be turned. On December 23, the weather broke. The clouds lifted. The fighter bombers came back. What followed was the same pattern Mortain had been, compressed into a smaller area and a colder week. The IX and the X9 tactical air commands together flew thousands of sorties against German columns that had nowhere left to hide. Most consequentially, on December 24, a column of the German 2nd Panzer Division, racing for the Meuse River, was caught in the open near a Belgian village called Celle, in the Foy Notre Dame area. American fighter bombers, working with British Royal Air Force units and ground forces of the United States 2nd Armored Division, broke the column into burning fragments along a stretch of road that has since become a small museum. The 2nd Panzer Division reached its furthest point of advance roughly 3 miles from the Meuse and never crossed it. The most famous American moment in the Bulge came during this same week, when the encircled defenders of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division and assorted attached units, held a road junction in the snow. For days they had no resupply because of the same weather that had grounded the Jabos. When the skies cleared on December 23, the Air Force flew supplies in by parachute, and the fighter bombers above the perimeter went to work on the German artillery and tanks ringing the town. A young P-47 pilot named Robert Coffey of the 365th Fighter Group, the unit that called itself the Hellhawks, flew repeated sorties in this period and would end the war with 6 aerial victories and a deputy command of his group. Hundreds of pilots like him kept the Bastogne corridor and the wider perimeter alive. When German prisoners were interrogated after the offensive collapsed, intelligence officers heard the same word coming out of the same lips it had come out of for 6 months. Jabo. The men captured in the Ardennes spoke of it with the same fatalism the men captured in Normandy had used. They said the offensive was over not because their tanks were running out of fuel, although they were, and not because their generals had run out of plans, although they had. They said the offensive was over because they could no longer move on the roads in daylight without dying. Part 9. After the war, when American intelligence officers had access to captured German records and to thousands of prisoner interrogation transcripts, the pattern that emerged from the Wehrmacht's own documents was striking. German divisional and corps level after-action reports, written by men who were trying to explain their defeats to their superiors, came back again and again to the same theme. They did not say they had been outfought by the American infantry, although in many engagements they had been. They did not say they had been outproduced by American factories, although they had been. They said, over and over, in the unsentimental dry prose that German staff officers used, that the operational mobility of their forces had been destroyed by Allied tactical air power. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, who had commanded the Panzer Lehr division on the Jabo Rennstrecke in June and had watched it disintegrate again at St. Lo in late July, gave one of the most famous descriptions of what fighter-bomber attack felt like on the ground. He said that during the Cobra carpet bombing, the bombers came as if on a conveyor belt, that by midday the entire area resembled the surface of the moon, and that several of his men went mad. By nightfall, Bayerlein said, Panzer Lehr was finally annihilated. That image, of an elite German armoured division reduced to a moonscape and a handful of unhinged survivors, became one of the most quoted German testimonies of the war, and it was the work of American air power. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West for most of the campaign, was interrogated by American officers after his capture in May of 1945. He told them that three things had defeated him in the West. The first was the unheard-of superiority of the Allied air forces. The second was the lack of motor fuel, which made it impossible for him to move what reserves he had. The third was the systematic destruction of every railway connection across the Rhine, which had been done from the air. He did not put the American or British infantry in his top three. He did not even put Allied artillery in his top three. He put the airplane first, the airplane second, and the airplane third. And in the most candid German testimony of all, in the diaries and letters of ordinary German soldiers preserved in archives in Munich and Freiburg and Stuttgart, the word Jabo appears with a frequency that makes it almost a punctuation mark. Soldiers writing to their wives, soldiers writing to their parents. They speak of waiting out the Jabos. They speak of friends who have been lost to the Jabos. They use the word as if it had always been part of the language. The verdict. So why did German soldiers in the summer of 1944 invent a brand new word? The shortest answer is that the German army had run out of older words for what was happening to it. Jabo did not arise because Allied air power had simply become numerous, although it had. It arose because the experience of being on the receiving end of American and British close air support, integrated through radio with ground commanders, supported by code breaking, flown by men in airplanes specifically built to absorb damage and deliver firepower at low altitude, was something for which no German military lexicon, however thorough, had a previous category. The Stuka had been a terror weapon used at decisive points against weaker enemies in the early war years. It had not been what the Allies had become. Quesada's pilots were not flying from England by the autumn of 1944. They were flying from rough advanced landing grounds in France, in some cases laid down within 24 hours of the ground being captured. The man inside the lead tank, talking up to them on the radio, sometimes had been their bunkmate the year before. The German army did not have an enemy in the air. It had an enemy in the air that was joined to the enemy on the ground in a way the doctrine writers in Berlin had never imagined. So the soldiers, in the ditches and the woods, did what soldiers always do. They reached for a smaller word, hammered it down to 2 syllables, and used it for everything, Jabo. By the end of 1944, you can read entire German staff documents in which the word becomes the load-bearing pillar of every single sentence. Move at night because of the Jabos. Disperse the trucks because of the Jabos. Postpone the counterattack until the weather grounds the Jabos. Strip Jabo out of those documents, and the sentences fall over. The Wehrmacht had become an army that could no longer write its own orders without referring to what an American kid in a Thunderbolt was doing 7,000 feet above its head. Part 10. Alexander Kartveli, the engineer who had drawn the Thunderbolt at Republic Aviation in 1940, lived to see his dinosaur become the most heavily produced American fighter of the entire war. 15,683 P-47s were built before production ended in 1945. Kartveli stayed at Republic and went on to design the F-84 Thunderjet, one of the first American jet fighters. He died on July 20th, 1974, in Huntington, on Long Island, not far from the Farmingdale plant where his airplane had been designed. Pete Quesada, who had pushed the system of armoured column cover into existence by personal force of will and personal friendship, retired from the United States Air Force in October of 1951 as a lieutenant general. He spent his later life as the first administrator of the new Federal Aviation Administration, where he served from 1958 to 1961, and as a co-owner of the new expansion Washington Senators Baseball Club. He died in 1993. The men who served under him in IX Tactical Air Command, the pilots who flew the 4 ship flights over the columns and called their friends in the lead tanks by their first names, scattered into the long peace. Some went back to factory floors. Some went home to farms. Some, like Robert Coffey of the 365th, continued to fly. Coffey was elected to Congress from Pennsylvania in 1948 and was killed 4 months later in a military aircraft accident at Kirtland Field, New Mexico. The men of Panzer Lehr, Das Reich, the 1st SS Leibstandarte, the 2nd Panzer Division, scattered too, those who had survived. Most never spoke publicly about what the summer of 1944 had been like for them. Some were captured at Falaise and spent the rest of the war in American or British prisoner of war camps, where their interrogations became part of the most candid written record we have of what they thought. Most went home to West Germany or East Germany and became carpenters and bookkeepers and machinists. The word they had brought back from France, Jabo, faded out of everyday German speech once the war was over and a new generation grew up. But it survived in the documents. It survived in the diaries that have since been published. It survived in the war diaries of the Panzer divisions, where the word still appears in handwriting on yellowed paper, an abbreviation that once meant nothing in particular, and that came, by August of 1944, to mean everything. The reason the German army needed a new word was not simply that the Allies had a lot of airplanes. The reason was that the airplanes were tied, by radio, by training, by trust, by the personal friendship of 2 American generals in a tent in Normandy, to the men on the ground in a way that no air force in the previous history of warfare had been tied to its army. The Thunderbolt was not the German army's enemy. The Thunderbolt plus the Sherman plus the air support party officer plus the radio plus the maintenance crew plus Pete Quesada's argument with Omar Bradley over a lukewarm cup of coffee sometime in late July, that was the German army's enemy. And against that, no single existing word in the German military vocabulary fit. So the soldiers, in the ditches and the woods, made a new one. That is what new words mean. They mean that something has happened in the world for which the old words were not enough. Lieutenant General Bayerlein, who had given the Jabo Rennstrecke its name on the road from Chartres in June, and had survived to surrender his last broken command in April of 1945, lived until 1970, and never quite stopped explaining, in interviews and memoirs, what the air over Normandy had felt like to a man on the ground. The word Jabo, as he and his soldiers had used it, never quite translated. It had been the private language of a defeated army, made up under fire, abandoned the moment the firing stopped, but for those who used it, in those final months of the war, it was the most accurate word in the German language. It was the word that meant the sky belongs to someone else now. It was the word that meant we cannot move. It was the word that meant we have lost the war, but no one in Berlin has yet admitted it. If this story gave you something to remember, hit the like button below. It is a small thing, but it keeps the names and the squadrons and the airfields a little more visible than they would otherwise be. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many of these stories. Most of them are about young men who flew aircraft they had not designed, off airstrips that had not existed a week earlier, in support of soldiers they had never met, against an enemy that had no word for what they were doing. And then, one summer afternoon outside Tilly-sur-Seulles, the enemy made one up.